Hello, I'm Smita Tharoor, and welcome to Stories of Unconscious Bias, a podcast where I ask guests from around the world to share their story and to reflect on their life experiences with unconscious bias. I hope you enjoy listening. They were recorded globally under COVID-19 lockdown conditions. Welcome, everyone. Google the name Lemn Sissay, and all the returning hits will be about him, because there is only one Lemn Sissay in the world. Lemn is a BAFTA-nominated award-winning writer, international poet, performer, playwright, artist, and broadcaster. He has read on stage throughout the world. I've heard him too, from the Library of Congress in the United States to the University of Addis Ababa, from Singapore to Sri Lanka, Bangalore to Dubai, from Bali to Greenland and Wigan Library. He was awarded an MBE for services to literature. Along with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Margaret Atwood, he won a PEN Pinter Prize in 2019. And if that's not all, he was the first poet commissioned to write for the London Olympics and poet of the FA Cup. For those of us living in the UK, you will, without any warning like I had, suddenly see a wall with his poetry on the wall. I remember that happening to me when I was last in Bradford. He is also the Chancellor of the University of Manchester and an honorary doctor from the Universities of Huddersfield, Manchester, Kent, and Brunei. So welcome, Dr. Lemn Sissay. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, Smita.
So unconscious bias, Lemn, that's what we're talking about. Two little words, perhaps. What do you understand by those two words?
Well, what I understand by the two words unconscious bias are, to me, it means when one has an action which one does not understand the workings behind the action, and for me, it's normally a negative action. So. Unconscious bias is when a person may have a bias against another person without understanding why.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And it's the bit about the without understanding why, because it's implicit and it's so quick. Our brain moves so fast. It's like what I say is like a click of a finger. And it's just so instinctive that you haven't even realized that you've jumped to that conclusion. And it may not even be about a person. It could be about a thing, a country, a place, I don't know, food. Perhaps you got enough stomach upset once and you never eat that food again. And you don't even remember that you lay in bed throwing up for 5 days when you were 3 years old. But yeah, that's exactly so right. But some stories then, because when you're saying that, you've obviously got stories in your mind of unconscious bias where maybe you jump to a conclusion about something. Could you share some stories with us?
Oh, where I jump to a conclusion of something, I guess an unconscious bias in my own life would be the judgments I made due to not understanding another person's language. So, for example, if somebody is speaking another language in my childhood years, in my teenage years, and I did not understand what they were saying, they were in conversation with each other, it was very easy for me to think that they were speaking negatively about me or about that they were doing something secretive, that they should speak in a language which I understand. So my unconscious bias is that something is negative is happening, and that would then make me feel negative towards those people.
Isn't that interesting? Because as you probably know, I think I did mention to you, I'm currently in lockdown Delhi. I came for work a few months ago and I haven't been able to leave because of coronavirus. And English is my first language, but I have the good fortune of speaking more than one language. But when I speak to someone whose English is not their first language, and then sometimes they might say something to me in English in an accent that I don't understand, it's so easy for me to just assume that, oh, that they're not very clever. How foolish. Why are they mispronouncing such a simple word? And that can also be, an unconscious bias, can't it? Whereas for you, it went one step further. It was not even about superiority. It was more about, hang on a minute, what are they saying that I don't understand? I bet it's about me. And so then you put more emotion into it. And then you end
I've
up perhaps
noticed,
not even talking to them.
yes, absolutely. I've noticed that this happens around the world, actually, is that when somebody speaks a different language in your own country, to me, that is a celebration. It's an opportunity for me to use other skills to listen to a person, because language is about context quite often when people are speaking. And if I reach for fear, then this person may be speaking about me. Then why don't I understand what this person is saying, etc., etc. And that can lead to all kinds of like strange behaviours. And it strikes me that it leads at the moment in England to a very dangerous place, which is the way that we have separated from mainland Europe. I think it's connected to fear of people who speak in other languages and bias against them. I think so. I don't know. I feel like I'm not being clear. I mean,
No, you are. Sure.
unconscious bias to me was mainly exact. I mainly felt like people put it on me as a child. I found that there was a lot of unconscious bias which manifested itself in racism, and the way that when when I was a newborn baby, I was renamed Norman, which is not the name that is on my birth certificate. And I do believe that the social worker thought that he was doing the right thing. And I would think of that as unconscious bias. He was not conscious that what he was doing was detrimental to me. He thought, because of his unconscious bias, he thought that if my name was Norman, I would have a better life.
Exactly. And that's actually, it's a wonderful example that you've given, Lem, purely because certainly many people in the United Kingdom who have foreign names, who are non-English names, mine and yours included, people find it difficult often to pronounce it. People put more their own unconscious biases into different expectations, because I think it comes a lot from ignorance. That's how I see it. And therefore they think, oh, if you're called Norman or Sam or Susan, then people will react to you better, and you will be more easy. You can more easily adapt to society. So as a baby, when the social worker made that decision to name you what he or she, the social worker, did, they were trying to help you. I agree with you. But then it's about their unconscious biases and the fact that so many people cannot see beyond certain narrow boundaries of what they are used to seeing. So it comes back down. Yes, go ahead.
It happens across the world. It happens I've experienced it here in the UK, but actually it happens everywhere. And there is an opportunity once you see unconscious bias, because there is nothing better than a person who is fully inhabiting their name, whatever it is. And the problem with unconscious bias is that it messes with the identity of the person who it's exacted on. The idea of changing my name, the social worker thought it was a positive thing, and actually it was an incredibly negative thing.
Thank you for that, because that's exactly that word that you said, the word identity. That's what makes us comfortable in our own skin. And if we human beings, whoever we are around the world, can be genuinely comfortable in our own skin, then we will possibly have less unconscious biases because we know who we are. Because we're talking about unconscious, right? We don't know who we are, and therefore we jump to conclusions about X, Y, or Z. They're linked, in my understanding. The more self-reflective, the more self-aware we are of who we are, the more we can approach the world in a more inclusive, accepting way. But if we are
And the
not
more,
comfortable, yes, go ahead.
no, please.
No, I was going to say
I mean,
what you're saying. The more I want you to finish because I know that I'm just agreeing with you. That's all.
well, it's a gift because once you become aware of your unconscious bias, you become more open to the world. And open to other languages and other shapes of faces, and that's pretty much the majority of the world. In other words, the more you get rid of your unconscious bias, you get rid of your fears, the happier you are in yourself, and the more connected you are with the world around you.
Exactly. And I often, I mean, certainly one of the reasons why I do what I do is because I was born and brought up in India, and I arrived in England in my 20s, very confident in my own identity, my name, my nationality, and my ethnicity and my culture. But there were so many people who looked like me, yet did not have that same confidence in their own identity because of their life experiences. And you are born to Ethiopians, but born and brought up in the United Kingdom, and then made change. Someone changed your name. So what does that do to you then and your identity growing up?
Well, I've found that I cannot be defined by the worst aspect of my identity, or I cannot be defined by society's attitudes towards people of color or towards me. I can't be defined by how well I can articulate the racism that's around me. Um, um, in other words, as someone who has been damaged by unconscious bias, I can't allow what I have seen to define me. Sorry, that sounds quite obscure. What I'm
Actually,
trying
it
to
doesn't.
say.
I'm silenced.
It,
It's not remotely obscure. It's very, very powerful. And I want to thank you for that, Len.
what happened to me is this, and I've just published a book about this. What happened to me is that because of unconscious bias, I was stolen from my mother. I was stolen from my family. I was brought up in institutions with foster parents who also, I believe, had a lot of unconscious bias towards people of color. And again, they did not know that they were unconsciously biased. I mean, that's
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And
Sorry,
why
I'm.
would they? You say, no, please. I mean, of course they didn't know. I mean, I know you. I've read your book. I've heard you speak on stage. I mean, I know of your story, and I've heard you, in many other guises, but many people wouldn't. And so, thank you for sharing that for the listeners to understand that your narrative, your personal stories, have defined you in a wonderful way, because what you've just said is so powerful that you won't allow someone else's unconscious biases and how they responded to you impact on how you see the world.
Yes, yes, it's so important that not to get sucked into the sort of yeah to it.
And yet, what I'm hearing, because I've had the wonderful privilege of hearing some amazing stories from different parts of the world, and sometimes when I'm speaking to somebody, I can hear them saying, I was so badly brutalized or traumatized by X, by a group of people because of something. Could be sexuality, could be religion, could be race. I mean, your difference, whatever that difference might be seen as. And then as a result, what so many people do is they put that entire group into a box, put the lock on it, and throw the key away, and won't have anything to do with all white people or all It
Men.
doesn't matter. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yes, I do. That's
Whereas
trauma.
you're saying, hang on, I'm going to keep my arms wide open and I'm going to be looking wide-eyed and I'm welcoming everyone. And that is the power that you have that so many other people don't have when they have genuinely been traumatized in their childhood.
Because we are offered a window when we've been hurt, when we've been traumatized, and it's because of unconscious bias that it's happened. We have an opportunity to not repeat that, but also we've seen something about humanity and that we can do something about. It seems really obvious to me, if you've been hurt, you need to heal. And if you're going to heal and you've been hurt, that gives you an opportunity to help others. It really does. And the idea of turning to the people who hurt me and hurting them, it doesn't make sense to me at all.
And yet it does to so many people around the world where I've been hurt and I'll hurt back. An eye for an eye. But the second half, as we all know, makes the whole world blind. But people don't remember the second half and they just think about the eye for an eye. And that is the not understanding that we all have unconscious biases, and therefore that person or group of people who may or have done something to me, to us, whoever the us is, I'm talking about me when I'm saying that, or you when you're saying that, rather than blaming them. So what you are doing is not blaming, and that's what makes your story so very powerful, Lem.
It's the idea that just because you're right, it doesn't mean to say that you're right almost. Just because you're right, it doesn't mean to say you have a whole set of actions that you can take up once you've discovered that you've been wronged. Can
you give us another story just to kind of to expand on what you've just said, because this is
this is a very different one. But when I became Chancellor at the University of Manchester, I talked to various people around the university. And it was beautiful because I would speak to the cleaners and the mainly women who were serving the food, and as well as lecturers, professors, students, etc. And I came across a caretaker, and I said, "Oh, hi, I'm the Chancellor at the University of Manchester," and he laughed, and he said, "No way. No, it's not true. You're having me on." And he could not believe that a person who looked like me would be his Chancellor. And it was an immediate sort of it was an immediate reaction. It wasn't, he wasn't being antagonistic. It was his first reaction was to laugh and go, "Come on, you're not the Chancellor."
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling because it's such a classic example of unconscious bias, because he didn't even realize what he sounded like when he said that. Or the assumptions that he had jumped to on what a chancellor should look like.
Yes, and I've received that in lots of places. I've been to places where people, where the security, at an event, not for the university, but for other events that I've been the speaker at, have immediately thought that I was not the person who was going to be on stage. And I look at them and I think, oh, that's definitely unconscious bias. The police stopping you in your car. It's a regular thing that happens to black men in Britain.
That's right.
And I think I've got a theory about when public figures who are black and male get stopped by the police in the car. Often it's because the police recognize the person
Oh,
And then, yes.
but they don't
They
put two and two and recognize why they recognize. Is that what you're saying?
exactly. The police officer
Ah,
thinks the reason if I recognize you, then it has to be something to do with my work.
right. Because you're black, obviously. Yes.
Yes, and this is why
Mm.
so many black, well-known people also get stopped by the police. This is my theory.
This is yeah.
Um,
No, that's an interesting theory.
yeah. So I think I saw you. I've seen you somewhere before, and if I've seen you somewhere before, it must be to do with crime. Now, if I was for want of a better term, if I was a white person in a car and they recognised me, they would go, "Oh, that's the guy from the television.
Mm.
That's the man who I saw the other night." But if you're black and a policeman recognises you, he thinks,
You can't be a successful
"Yeah,
black person.
exactly."
Right. I know what you're saying. That's a good theory, actually. And I mean, and how many times have you been stopped? I'm curious to know, Lem.
Oh, countless. I mean, I actually stopped driving my car. I sold it. I mean, because I was
Oh no.
in London, but actually it's all connected. I find that the rites of passage for black men, or I'll talk about myself. Actually, that's the better way to do it. Are sort of guarded by unconscious bias. So, for example, if in the north of England, more than one black male is going into a public house or into a club, they will be looked on with more suspicion if they're in a group, because a group makes a gang. If, as a young man, I'm in a car, I'll be stopped by the police because what are you doing driving that car in this area, whatever it is. If I had a relationship with for want of a better term, white person in England, and I walked into a bar or a public space, there are people who, in their unconscious bias, would be thinking, what are you doing with her, and how dare you take our women? That's an old trope of
Yes, it
racism.
is.
So all of these, if I was a professional, as I was at 20 years of age, I was a literature development worker, people would come into the office and say, are you a student working here? It seemed to me that every development of my into adulthood as a young black male in England was judged by a very forceful unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Every section, relationships, socializing, professional life, consistently sort of, and even people would say, "Oh, you've only got this far because you're black, because you use the race card." I mean, I'm 30 years into my profession now, and it seems we have
And
to
it's
do
just
more to
patronizing.
overcome. Yeah, we have to do more to overcome the unconscious bias.
Yeah,
And the worst thing about unconscious bias is that you can't. It's very difficult to tell somebody that you've seen it because it's their unconscious bias.
yes. And then all we end up doing is becoming more divisive and putting people on the defensive. So you've
Oh,
actually achieved nothing then, have you?
so
So,
tiring.
it's exhausting, because if you see someone showing racism, which is actually what has been happening to you specifically in your childhood and right up to today in many different ways, whether it's microaggressions or straightforward pulling you up in the car and asking why you're driving this car and so on. It doesn't matter which it is. But the minute you push back in any kind of situation, and this is for me, that's my experience. I'm not suggesting I'm right. I'm just kind of throwing this at you. Is that you push back, what you will get is that individual goes on the defensive, and then all we are then doing is continuing to create these narrow little silos where people continue to expect black people to behave in a certain way and white people to behave in a certain way, and surely you're white, so surely you're going to be racist, and that kind of thing,
Yes,
which is not the way we should be approaching it,
the
rather
whole.
than understanding our own unconscious biases. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, to hear people like you sharing your stories and helping us and the listeners understand that actually let's reflect for ourselves. I mean, for those of us who don't know Lemn Sissay, please Google and find out more than what is just heard in the podcast, because Lemn has an amazing story. And then when you hear Lemn speaking and saying that I'm not going to be defined by somebody else's unconscious bias, what does that then say about you and your learning? And that's what makes it so powerful. That's what we all need to be doing. And it doesn't matter what color skin we are. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. You just reminded me that, it's easier to point out other people's unconscious bias. But I would say that if you were to ask me about my unconscious bias, which you have, I would say that an example I would give is that when my book came out in August last year in hardback, I was asked to be on stage all over the United Kingdom, and I would have a person on stage asking questions of me, and sort of having a on stage Q&A. And I had to make a conscious decision to ask for my interviewers to be women and women of color. Now, also it wasn't just women of color. It was all different kinds of women. If you don't do that, remember, I'm 30 years into my career, and this is the first time I've done that. So, if you don't make that stipulation, 90% of the time, the people interviewing you will be men, because they come down to, because at that level there's a lot of competition, and men will mainly be the people on stage. And so you have to first identify where is my unconscious bias, and then go, what can I do about it? Mm-hmm. And where is everybody else's unconscious bias? Because mine is part of a wider unconscious bias, is often verified by because it's not been challenged.
Yes.
So I then had to write down a list of women that I would like to be interviewed by, and it worked for the better because the interviews were more interesting.
Of course, brilliant. I'm just thrilled. I had no idea. I have seen you on stage once being interviewed by a woman. I can't remember who it was now, but you were brilliant.
Yeah, and I didn't tell them that on and I don't normally talk about that as well. It's not really something. These are not things to talk about. These are actions.
Of course they are.
It's an action which will challenge unconscious bias. It really is. It has to be actions. All of the talk and all of the theorizing is one thing, but we need to make actions that's where you put your money where your mouth is. And actually, the interesting thing about that for me is that the result is surprisingly good. In fact, you could say it's even better than it would have been if you'd have left it down to the default.
And that says something really, really fundamental. And it's not just about somebody who happens to be a talented poet and is having an interview on stage. It's about any one of us just having normal jobs in normal workplaces. And rather than going with the status quo of always getting the same person to be your assistant in the team, to fulfill a project, it doesn't matter what. Think if you are in a position of authority, let's just call it a manager in an office.
Yes.
Often they will keep doing the same thing because it's the easy option. And that could look like, as you have given an example, of being a man or a white man, for that matter, who interviews you. Whereas instead of the manager was to stop and to think and to say, oh, yes, that person, and it's not necessarily about gender, I'm thinking about just the fact that we challenge our unconscious biases, recognize that we always go for the default position. And instead, let's stop and think and do something different. And that's what you have pushed because you can, because you have that position of influence. You've been able to actually make people think differently, which is fantastic. It's brilliant. It's a great example that can be used in any environment, in any kind of workplace, not just necessarily with an interview situation. Thank you for that. So what else, Lemn? I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. I really could. But perhaps if you could just share with us perhaps one more little story, that would be amazing.
Just on that last point, just before I answer your question, is the definition of madness is doing the same thing all over again. The definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Brilliant.
And that's that's personal madness, but it's also institutional madness.
Yes.
Wow. Whereas unconscious bias affected me in my life, and that means whether I use my own unconscious bias or somebody else's. I mean, as a young person, as a young adult, I used to get in Manchester followed around the shop by the store detective because they were assuming that I was going to steal something. And that's another regular kind of event that happens to black. I know that happens to black young men. I think it happens to women as well. It actually happened to my sister.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
She came. Say it's more gender and race, but women as well, right?
Yeah, she works for the city in Paris, and she came over to England, and she just was accused in a store of stealing something which she didn't do. And again, she didn't get angry with the store detective. She just sort of sorted out the problem. But I'm trying to think of a better example of unconscious bias. I've noticed when I'm speaking with women that I listen differently to women than I do to men, I think.
Oh, yeah. Why is that, I wonder?
Yeah. Well, I noticed, I think, that I would more likely speak over a woman than a man. I'm not totally sure about this, by the way, but I think there's something in it. I noticed that I try not to do that now, and I might also do it with men as well, actually. But I just noticed that there's a new word that's gone around called mansplaining.
Oh God, yes, I've heard it.
And it's where a woman says something and the man says it back, exactly the same thing in a different way, and assumes that he wants to get the credit for.
And do you think you do that? Well, I've never noticed that.
No, I don't think I do it actually, but I think I notice that it's an unconscious bias. Okay. So the unconscious bias is that it is unconscious. So I often have to remind myself of my listening skills. Let me give you a better example. I was once told years ago that teachers are more reactive to boys than to girls. When I heard that, I realized that when I'm teaching, I must either be aware of that or I must actually encourage the girls to speak.
So it's not your unconscious bias, but it's, I mean, I'm giving you credit because I can't even visualize how that would look if you were talking over women. I have spoken to you and I don't think you've ever done that. I've interrupted you a few times in this conversation, but you have never spoken over me. But it's a very interesting point that you've made, though, that it's about how the teachers perceive students, and that they listen to men or boys, young men, more than they do young. That's very interesting. I didn't know that fact. And I've now just recently become a University of Arts associate professor teaching students. So I must remind myself of that lesson too. So it's not about our gender, maybe. It's about how we, as somebody in a position of authority, as a teacher, see students around us, men and women.
Yes, and if a student, I mean, this is a wider thing, but if a student is quieter, it doesn't mean to say that they are less intelligent, for example. But unconscious bias makes one feel that the student that I'm engaging with is more intelligent than the student who is quieter, and that's just not true.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And I do think that boys have more of a propensity to put themselves out there than girls as a whole. What am I trying to say? Yeah, I'm sorry, I've just lost myself.
No, I think you've made a valid point, and I think and certainly for those of us who teach at all at any level, and I do occasionally at the University of Arts, I must thank you for that lesson, because I'm telling myself that because I'm not that aware certainly about gender. I am very aware about the talkative ones and the not so talkative ones, and I think perhaps many people would recognize that about giving. Again, it doesn't have to be teaching; it could be a team meeting,
Absolutely.
One person has a lot to say, and so you always look at that one person and give them eye contact. Whereas the quiet one actually has a lot to say, but doesn't say it because that eye contact hasn't happened and is not encouraged to speak. And that's about our unconscious bias. So yes, I think it's a very valid lesson that we should all learn. So Lemn, can you give us you have already, but if I can kind of summarize all the wonderful stuff that you've already shared, what kind of advice or what can we learn from not just hearing you, but from our own experiences? What can you help us understand in terms of our challenging our own unconscious biases?
I think it's especially at the present situation that we're in with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and even the lockdown. It's good for us to lean in to our fears. So if our reaction is to feel affronted by Black Lives Matter, then actually I would suggest that we lean in to Black Lives Matter and find out what it was we were afraid of. Because all of this work is so that we can break down our fears. And as you break down your fear, you become a more whole person. And you can give more, and your productivity is more. So it's about looking at our blind spots and finding gold in there.
That's very moving. And to lean in and to look at our blind spots and to be kind to ourselves, really, because you're actually being kind to yourself by doing that.
That's very important.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. I've so enjoyed this conversation, and I could keep talking for hours, but I should end it on this wonderful piece of advice that you've given us. Lemn Sissay, I hugely enjoyed talking with you on Stories of Unconscious Bias. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
This is the last episode of the first season of Stories of Unconscious Bias. I hope you enjoyed listening. In season 2, which begins on Saturday, August 29th, I'll be discussing stories of unconscious bias with historian William Dalrymple, author of Arts of Seduction Seema Anand, Somali-Irish social activist Ifra Ahmed, my brother Shashi Tharoor, and many others. We share stories in class, the Kama Sutra, sexuality, religion, and so much more.